Chansei, I'm Krisanachkite. Welcome to APTN National News. Thank you for joining us. With the federal election just 4 days away, we take a look at the newly formed riding of Sault Ste. Marie Algoma. APTN's Mike McDonald spoke with two of the candidates looking to represent a riding where the ongoing trade dispute with the U.S. is especially felt.
Sault Ste. Marie sits on the Canada-U.S. border and is heavily reliant on the steel industry. The federal riding of Sault Ste. Marie Algoma is also home to a number of First Nations communities. Liberal Terry Sheehan has represented the former riding of Sault Ste. Marie since 2015 and has long had a connection with the local First Nations community.
My wife and kids are members of Batchewana First Nation, so it's a very personal thing for me as well. So I plan on serving the First Nation communities, the Indigenous communities, the urban Indigenous residents that are here in some of the communities that are attached to First Nations around Canada.
Laura Mayer carries the NDP banner into this election. Mayer is from Mississauga First Nation, where she currently serves as a band councillor.
I know the issues very well. I was the senior political advisor for the Nishnawbek Nation. I worked within Mississauga First Nation for quite a long time. And from anywhere from healthcare to housing to economic development to justice, I have a really deep understanding of what the issues are for First Nations communities.
Sheehan says one of the issues he'll focus on if re-elected will be economic development.
Economic and business development, I see opportunity everywhere, especially in the Indigenous communities. There are so many great ideas, great businesses. I work very well with a number of Indigenous businesses, helping them grow. I used to work in helping them start, but also skill development too.
Mayer says there are a pair of issues that she's heard about from Indigenous and non-Indigenous voters while on the campaign trail.
There's two things I think that unify all of the people that I've spoken to. One is tariffs and economic instability. Wondering about ensuring that our economy is protected, that our jobs are protected, and the other thing that's unifying is healthcare. People are very focused on trying to get primary health care. They might not have a family doctor.
Sault Ste. Marie Algoma is one of the swing ridings recently identified by the Assembly of First Nations. Former Sault Ste. Marie Police Chief Hugh Stevenson is running for the Conservatives. He did not respond to our request for an interview. Mike McDonald, APTN National News, Sault Ste. Marie.
On Wednesday, Federal Conservative Party leader Pierre Poilievre promised to give police the power to dismantle encampments and arrest those living in them if his party is elected. At a campaign stop in Hamilton on Wednesday, Poilievre said a Conservative government would amend the criminal code to give police the power to remove and criminally charge people living in encampments. He also said his government would make changes allowing judges to mandate drug addiction treatment as part of prison sentences and will fund 50,000 addiction treatment spaces. The Conservative Party of Canada also released their official platform on Wednesday, just 5 days away from the federal election on Monday. It says a Conservative government would return to a housing-first approach to eliminating homelessness, ensuring people get off the streets into a stable place to live. And a reminder that APTN News will have extensive coverage on election night on Monday, April 28th. Our coverage here will kick off at 9 p.m. Eastern Time. Here's Dennis Ward with an update.
APTN News will have reporters spread out across the country, including at the headquarters of Liberal leader Mark Carney, Conservative leader Pierre Poilievre, and NDP leader Jagmeet Singh. Creason and I will also be joined in studio by the former president of the Métis National Council, Cassidy Caron, and Truth in Politics panelist Jennifer Leywitz. Negon Sinclair will also be joining us from Toronto. Nouvelle Nationale host Kim Sullivan will head up our coverage from our Ottawa studio, where she will be joined by McGill University professor Veldon Coburn and former Enoch Member of Parliament Peter Itinawar. Our Decision 2025 coverage begins at 9 p.m. Eastern on APTN. You can also stream it live on our website, aptnnews.ca.
To Saskatchewan now, where a Saskatoon judge handed down a sentence on Wednesday in the matter of a medicine man who sexually assaulted those who asked for his help. CTV's Haley Mandrick tells us how long he'll be behind bars and shares a reaction from the courtroom.
It was an emotional day in the courtroom as a self-proclaimed Indigenous healer was sentenced to 8 years in prison for 12 counts of sexual assault, all involving former patients. Several people were seen crying in the courtroom as the verdict was handed down. 64-year-old Cecil Wolf pleaded guilty to the charges back in February. The 12 female victims had turned to Wolf for traditional Indigenous treatment. The assaults occurred between 2012 and 2021, in which Wolf would touch the women inappropriately during what he claimed to be a treatment session.
This case was about one man victimizing Indigenous women. And what he did was fraudulent and does not speak for the Indigenous culture or anyone else other than himself.
The judge spoke to the seriousness of the crime, referring to the, quote, heart-wrenching victim impact statements. Judge John Morrell went on to emphasize that 10 out of the 12 victims were Indigenous women, which put them in a, quote, particularly vulnerable situation, adding that Wolf abused his position of trust and authority as an elder and medicine man. Originally, the Crown requested a 10-year sentence, and the defense argued for 4 to 5 years. In addition to 8 years behind bars, Wolf's name will permanently be on a sex offenders registry. Hallie Mandrick, CTV News, Saskatoon.
The family of a First Nation man who went missing in Edmonton 2 weeks ago was hoping the public can help find him and bring him home. They say they're concerned for his health and well-being, and he's without his medication. 66-year-old Brian Wesley Potts was last seen leaving the Royal Alexander Hospital in Edmonton on April 10th after a visit with his son. He was wearing a brown camouflage hat, a dark blue Edmonton Oilers hoodie, light brown pants, and brown shoes. On April 15th, Edmonton police say Potts was seen getting off a transit bus and walking towards the Westmount Shopping Centre. Potts, who is from the Alexis Nakota Sioux Nation just west of Edmonton, lives with dementia and is diabetic and in need of his medication. Police say Potts is also known to frequent the Stony Plain Road area in West Edmonton. Candace Alexis is the missing man's niece.
The Lord is keeping him safe, and I really believe with my whole heart that God can keep anybody from death and from sick and from being, because I know he needs medication for his illnesses and his sicknesses, but I believe and trust in God that God is keeping him right now and can keep him alive and safe and protected.
In September of 2020, Chelsea Poorman went missing in Vancouver. 2 years later, her body was found outside a vacant mansion in an affluent neighborhood in the same city. Her family recently held a memorial walk in honor of Chelsea and 2 other Indigenous women found around the same time. APTN's Tina House speaks with a family member of Poorman.
We're here in Vancouver's Shaughnessy neighborhood, where it was 3 years ago that the body of Chelsea Poorman was found. Joining me today is her sister Diamond. Diamond, nice to see you today.
Thank you.
Tell me, what is this big crowd here doing?
So today we're honoring the 3rd year anniversary that my sister has been found at the Shaughnessy mansion in the back, actually. So it's very important that I bring awareness for her and the other families too, because they were found around weeks within each other. So yeah.
It's amazing to see the community's support here coming out to help you and your family get the message across. What have the police said about her mysterious death?
Really, they just kind of shut it down the best they could and just said it was non-suspicious, non-foul play, but everything about it speaks the complete opposite, really.
And what would you like the police to do further?
To acknowledge all of it and to bring the answers that we deserve, and also for accountability towards the neglect and the scrutiny that they've caused. And yeah.
We're also honoring a couple of other women as well, Tatiana Harrison as well as Noello Soup. What do you want to say about those families, what they've been going through?
Well, I just want to be here to fight for them as well, because they are really struggling and healing and trying their hardest to grieve, and it's been extremely hard for them. So I just want to be the one that's strong enough to speak on their behalf for them and bring awareness for them as well, because they all matter just as much, right?
Indigenous women or families
Absolutely. Can you tell me a little bit about your sister Chelsea?
Chelsea was an amazing human being with like such a personality and humor and just always positive. She's been through so many dark experiences, a lot of painful things that have happened to her, and she's always been able to stay strong and be happy no matter what and stay positive. So I really appreciate that about her.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for your time, and our sincere condolences to you and your family, and we really do hope you get the answers that you're looking for. Thanks, Diamond. Nice to see you. Back to you in studio.
The Moosomin First Nation in northern Saskatchewan has a reason to celebrate this week. That story when we come back. Stay with us. Welcome back. The Moosomin First Nation and the RM of Poorman Park signed a memorandum of understanding on Wednesday, which will mean almost 900 acres of land in the RM will be given to reserve status. As CTV's Carla Shinkaruk reports, it also creates a mutual working relationship.
With this handshake, a memorandum of understanding was signed, which has been over 30 years in the making.
It is a wonderful day for us. Very gratifying. Today is a very historical day. A part of our ambitions have been accomplished today.
Stephen Whitecap, along with Catherine Gladeau, were part of the original Moosomin Council, which started the process to get the 900 acres of land west of Saskatoon transferred to reserve land.
Oh, it's a big accomplishment because it's as the Saskatoon expands, It's in an industrial area.
It's beneficial, according to Gladdeau, in terms of helping form businesses and partnerships for Moosomin First Nation. It was part of a federal and provincial review under the Canada-Saskatchewan Treaty Land Entitlement Framework. It was an agreement in 1992.
Right now, everything's in motion. We got everything going to reserve status and whatnot. So working with the RM now, I think it'll help speed up a lot of this process.
Once these lands, seen in red, have reserve status, they will no longer be subject to municipal taxation or bylaws.
On the commercial side of things, we have all kinds of aspirations, hotel, that economic engine that is lacking in Saskatoon, we need to find.
Which is believed to foster relationship building between the First Nation and RM, ultimately fulfilling reconciliation goals.
It's good development for the RM. It's good for the Moosomin's First Nation, and it's just good in general.
And also promising for the youth of Moosomin First Nation.
I think it's going to mean a lot for them because at the end of the day, they are the future of our community.
Carla Shinkaruk, CTV News, Saskatoon.
We've all heard the term, if I could rewrite history. Well, in Regina, students at the First Nations University did just that. They are part of a unique class where past written articles are rewritten to reflect today's society. Here now is Indigenous Communication Arts student Tyrone Perot with that story.
Yes, context is like part of the mix. You can't have a story without the context.
Indigenous journalism and communication arts students at the First Nations University of Canada held an exhibition showcasing their reworks of historical articles. The students were tasked with finding an article from the late 1800s to the 1990s relating to Indigenous issues. They found many of the historical articles were missing crucial information that provided the full context of the story. This led to biased narratives being published, further perpetuating one-sided perspectives on Canadian history. As part of this project, students conducted research and reworked their historical articles to include the missing information. This allowed students to provide an updated and, more importantly, accurate account of their chosen story.
As journalists, how we write and what we write, that getting a clear picture, saying things could make a lot of difference. Like, can we rewrite history? No, but we could probably change it. We could probably change a lot of things. We have a lot of power, right? And you look at the whole story instead of just part of the story.
Journalism has roots that go back hundreds of years in Indigenous communities. The students learned the importance of looking back and analyzing stories from a historical context.
Journalism is a point-in-time practice, and that point-in-time practice means everything that we knew up until that point, that individual themselves. And what is actually happening here is we're taking that point-in-time practice and we're making this more about, okay, what are the things that we could fill in here? What's the context? What's some of the legislation? What's the policy here? What were people doing? Where were they living? And just putting everything together to kind of just enhance it and make it stronger.
This course has taught the students the importance of ensuring they provide the full context in their stories as future journalists.
We constantly have to revamp history, rewrite history with new perspectives and new contexts that weren't given in the past. So I think as much as these lessons really apply to our own work and the own lessons that we're going to carry throughout our careers, I think we also need to apply them to work that's already been done.
Although the public showcase is ended, the students' works will continue to be displayed at the First Nations University in the coming months. In Regina, I'm Tyrone Perot.
It's Thursday, and that means Fraser Needham joins us now from Ottawa to tell us what's ahead on this evening's Nation to Nation.
Coming up after the evening news, with less than a week to go before Election Day, all the major parties have now released their platforms. We talked to Pam Palmater of Toronto Metropolitan University about how they rate on Indigenous issues. Hill Times columnist Rose LeMay also joins us to talk about her new book on reconciliation. And we catch up with APTN reporter Angel Moore, who all this week has been at the United Nations Permanent Forum on Indigenous Issues in New York City. All this ahead on Nation to Nation.
Thank you, Fraser. We now want to tell you about this week's third web poll question. Over on our website, we ask, which Canadian NHL team do you think has the best chance of winning the Stanley Cup? The Toronto Maple Leafs, the Winnipeg Jets, the Edmonton Oilers, Ottawa Senators, Montreal Canadiens, or unsure? Go to our website at aptnnews.ca/polls to cast your ballot. Last I checked, the unsure vote was in the lead. We'll continue our federal election coverage when we come back right after this commercial break. Starting on the east, -1 in St. John's, Charlottetown 4. Anujiwak -5, the Grand River 1. Saguenay 6, St. Jovite 10. 15 in Toronto, Peterborough, rain and 15. Sudbury, sunny and 12, Elliott Lake 8. Norway House 6, Thompson 4. 9 in Winnipeg, Dauphin 8. Swift Current 9, Yorkton 5. 5 in La Ronge, Stony Rapids -2. Showers in Fort McMurray at 14, Fort Chipewyan 6. Lethbridge 15, Calgary 16. Tofino 15, Vancouver, sun and 17. Smithers 17, Prince George 16. Watson Lake 10, Old Crow -4. 1 in Wati, Wrigley -1. Sax Harbor -10, Tuktoyaktuk -8. Baker Lake -10, Chesterfield -13. And Arctic Bay -4, Clyde River -5. During this election, Indigenous leadership and experts have highlighted that Indigenous issues are not being discussed enough among party leaders. We recently spoke with Cody Grote, who is Mohawk and an assistant professor of history and Indigenous studies at Western University. He shared his insight on this issue and many others within this election. Cody Grote, thank you so much for chatting with us. Indigenous issues have been absent throughout this federal campaign, quite different from when Justin Trudeau ran in previous elections. Can you explain what happens when these issues are not discussed?
I feel the number one part of the dialogue that we're hearing this election is sovereignty. And when we hear Canadian sovereignty really being promoted as the election issue, it in some ways by necessity erases this question of Indigenous sovereignty. And I think that's extremely problematic because that's where we've been making headway in a lot of these conversations, is recognizing us as sovereign nations. And when we focus on that Canadian nationalism and that Canadian sovereignty, the dialogue shifts, and that's going to shift every associated issue that relates to Indigenous peoples in this country.
Cody, are you a bit worried that because these Indigenous issues are not being talked about enough in this campaign, does that mean Indigenous issues will not be important when Parliament resumes after the election, no matter who wins?
I think that's a really valid question, and if you look at both the Liberal and Conservative parties, which have now released their platforms, you see that there is quite an absence in anything in relation to Indigenous peoples. The Conservative platform, which came out April 22nd, has conversation and language about our Indigenous peoples, which seems to me a little bit antiquated from what we've seen in recent dialogue. We've also seen the Conservative Party trying to shift the language and the funding towards sole and individual First Nations governance. I think there's some value in that, but I think it's also trying to alleviate some of the federal government's responsibilities, that nation-to-nation, crown-to-nation relationships. So I think we have to be careful of some of that language and how it's being introduced. When it comes to the Liberal platform, I'm surprised to see some of the policy planks that they're acting on. For example, expanding reserve lands and expanding reserve territories is included in the Liberal platform. So I think that we're not seeing it as discussed as I think it needs to be. We're seeing in the platforms, in some platforms it is really not mentioned at all. In other platforms it is there to an extent, but the dialogue definitely is not reflecting the concerns that need to be addressed.
Cody, what are some Indigenous topics you think party leaders should be talking about right now?
I think obviously the dialogue of reconciliation, we're at 10 years to the TRC in 2025, so we're going to be acknowledging that 10-year anniversary in the coming weeks and months. And I think one thing that we need to recognize is how the majority of the calls to action have not been addressed. We have calls to justice from the Missing and Murdered Indigenous Women and Girls National Inquiry. Again, those have not been addressed. So I think when we have this general dialogue about reconciliation that federal governments like to act upon, we also have very clear and tangible actions that have been requested over the years, and we're not acting upon those. We've not seen those acted upon. So when we acknowledge the 10th anniversary of the TRC, we also have to recognize there's a lot of work that needs to be put in that's not been done yet.
Vancouver Island Conservative candidate Aaron Gunn, whose social media posts against Indigenous people have sparked a lot of controversy, Pierre Poilievre has decided to stand by him. Should Indigenous people be worried about this?
I think they should be. I think one thing that we're seeing is the federal Conservative Party is trying to fit a lot of different interests into the same party tent. I think we're probably seeing some fractures in that tent now, where we're seeing perhaps more of a progressive conservative wing trying to fight against this more socially conservative wing. But Pierre is trying to cater to that socially conservative wing, which is using this rhetoric that is anti-Indigenous, residential school denialist, some of that language. So again, perhaps it won't reflect the actions of the government if it were to be elected, but the fact that the federal party leader is catering to that rhetoric is definitely concerning.
Finally, Cody, do you think Indigenous people will make their voices heard in this election? And is there a lot at stake here?
One thing that we often see is we see some reserve communities or some First Nations saying that, this is a foreign election. This is a national government that is not our sovereign nations. So we see some First Nations denying Elections Canada from having polling places within reserve lands and within reserve territories. I think that's entirely valid. And again, we're seeing this rhetoric of Canadian sovereignty being really pushed this election, and that's minimizing this language and rhetoric of Indigenous sovereignty. So in my opinion, we're probably going to see consistent voting turnout from First Nations, Inuit and Métis communities compared to other elections. But as we know, that's been historically low for a number of reasons.
Cody Grote is the assistant professor with the Western University in Ontario. Cody, thank you for speaking with us today.
Thank you for having me.
That's your daytime newscast for this Thursday, April 24th. Dennis Ward is back for your evening newscast along with a new edition of Truth in Politics. Please join us then. From all of us at APTN National News, hi miigwech masicho kwana. Thank you for watching. We'll see you again next day.